The room froze. Ted Cruz leaned forward, jabbing his finger like a man trying to hammer authority into the air itself. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat upright, unshaken, her eyes steady, her face calm. The tension between them wasn't just political, it was electric, the kind of moment where every camera zooms in and every viewer leans closer. Cruz's voice, sharp and insistent, had been cutting her off again and again, 6 times already. His interruptions weren't questions, they were weapons designed to dominate, to strip her of space, to force her into silence. But Crockett hadn't folded. She hadn't shouted back. She hadn't even flinched. And now, as he went in for his 7th attempt, convinced he could bury her beneath his interruptions, something happened that neither he nor the nation watching was prepared for. Ted Cruz thought he could bulldoze Jasmine Crockett with interruptions. But when he tried it a 7th time, she delivered a reply that shut him down in front of the nation. The silence that followed was deafening. His finger still hovered midair. His mouth, half open, searching for a retort, never found the words. And Crockett, she leaned forward just slightly, her composure unbroken, her reply ringing in the ears of everyone in the chamber. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because calm truth delivered with conviction can silence even the loudest arrogance. It was a moment that ricocheted far beyond that room, clipped, shared, replayed millions of times. A senator brought to silence. A congresswoman refusing to bow. A clash that became more than just political theater. It became a parable about dignity, representation, and the right to be heard. But here's the thing. Viral moments don't happen in a vacuum. They are born from deeper struggles, histories, and forces that collide in a single instant. What we saw that day wasn't just Cruz versus Crockett. It was old power versus new resolve, arrogance versus dignity, control versus representation. And to understand why this moment stunned everyone, we need to go back. Ted Cruz had built his reputation on being the bulldog of the Senate, relentless, sharp-tongued, a man who prided himself on drowning out opponents with sheer volume and confidence. For years, he'd sharpened that skill in debates, cable news appearances, and Senate hearings. To some, he was a warrior. To others, a bully. Either way, one thing was certain. When Cruz entered a room, he expected to dominate it. On the other side sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman, still early in her tenure but already known for her fiery clarity and refusal to shrink back. She was young compared to Cruz, newer to Washington's power games, but she carried something he underestimated: the lived weight of communities who had been silenced, dismissed, and interrupted for generations. To her, being cut off wasn't just political theater, it was personal history repeating itself. That's what made the clash so raw. This wasn't just another debate. It was about something deeper: respect, representation, and the right to be heard. When Cruz leaned in, interrupting again and again, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett he was trying to talk over. It was the millions of voices she carried with her, the voters who had sent her to Congress precisely because she refused to be silenced. The tactic was familiar. Cruz's interruptions weren't designed to uncover truth or sharpen arguments. They were meant to break rhythm, to seize control of the narrative, to make sure the spotlight stayed on him. In his mind, the louder man wins. And in politics, perception often is reality. If you can talk over someone long enough, maybe the public assumes they have nothing worth saying. But that calculation carried a risk. Because what happens when the person you try to drown out refuses to sink? What happens when the silence you try to enforce backfires? When your interruptions become proof not of strength, but of insecurity? Each time Cruz cut her off, the anticipation in the room grew heavier. Observers leaned in. Staffers exchanged glances. Cameras caught every twitch, every sigh, every jab of his finger. The injustice of it all was plain. He wasn't debating her, he was trying to erase her. And yet Crockett's calm composure only magnified the imbalance. Where he was loud, she was steady. Where he was forceful, she was unflinching. That contrast was already telling a story far bigger than their words. It became more than an exchange between two politicians. It became a test of whether dignity could hold its ground against arrogance, a test of whether a rising voice could withstand the machinery of interruption designed to bury it, a test of whether truth, spoken calmly, could cut through the noise. And as the interruptions piled up, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 6, audiences watching from their screens weren't just seeing politics. They were seeing a reflection of their own frustrations. How many times had ordinary people been talked over in boardrooms, classrooms, or family tables? How many had felt that sting of being silenced, not because they lacked substance, but because someone louder wanted control? That was the emotional charge building in this room. Cruz thought he was showing dominance, but to those watching, he was revealing something else: fear of what happens when a woman like Crockett speaks freely. But what Cruz didn't realize, Crockett had faced silencing attempts her whole life, and she was ready. To understand why this clash with Jasmine Crockett carried so much weight, you first have to understand Ted Cruz. His story is not one of humble struggle or quiet sacrifice. It's one of ambition sharpened from the earliest days of his life. Born Rafael Edward Cruz, he carried both the drive of an immigrant father and the privilege of an American upbringing. By the time he reached adulthood, Cruz had cultivated an image: the brilliant Ivy League conservative, destined for power. Princeton gave him polish, Harvard Law gave him credentials, and his years on the national debate circuit gave him a weapon, a tongue trained to slice through opponents with speed and precision. Cruz became known as a debate champion who never sought to understand, only to win. Every exchange was a battlefield, every word a weapon. He didn't listen to opponents, he waited for openings to dominate them. His victories weren't about truth, but about control. And as he rose in Texas politics, that skill set transformed into a public persona, the bulldog senator who relished confrontation. In Washington, that style made him infamous. He filibustered for hours on end, once reading Dr. Seuss, green eggs and ham on the Senate floor as if governance were a performance stage. He became a fixture on cable news, where volume and certainty mattered more than substance. To his supporters, he was a warrior against liberal overreach. To his critics, he was a grandstanding opportunist, always chasing the next headline, the next viral moment, the next base-pleasing soundbite. But behind the veneer of sharp intellect lay contradictions that never quite went away. Cruz styled himself as a defender of American families, but when a deadly winter storm paralyzed Texas and millions shivered without power, he boarded a plane to Cancun. Images of the senator dragging his suitcase through an airport became a national symbol of hypocrisy, an elected leader fleeing hardship while his constituents froze. The backlash was swift. Even allies cringed. But Cruz, ever the debater, spun excuses, claiming he was only escorting his daughters on vacation, as if leadership could be paused when inconvenient. It was classic Cruz, intellectual rationalization used to mask arrogance. And this pattern wasn't new. Over and over, Cruz had positioned himself as the loudest voice in the room, yet the substance behind that voice often faltered under scrutiny. He railed against Washington insiders while climbing the very ladders of establishment power. He framed himself as a defender of conservative values, yet bent those values when political opportunity beckoned. His critics saw him as less a statesman and more a chameleon, adjusting colors for survival, for attention, for relevance. That's what made him so effective at interruption. The tactic was never just about the moment. It was about maintaining dominance, keeping the spotlight fixed on him. He thrived not by persuasion but by exhaustion, overwhelming opponents with a flood of words until resistance wore down. And yet, there was always an undercurrent of insecurity in that style, because behind the relentless talking was the fear of silence. Silence meant others could think for themselves. Silence meant the illusion of control might break. So Cruz filled the air, always talking, always cutting in, always asserting. But arrogance, when wielded too long, has a way of curdling. For many Americans, Cruz became less a fighter and more a caricature, a senator who mistook interruption for intellect, who mistook bluster for leadership. His Ivy League pedigree and debate trophies gave him polish, but they couldn't erase the impression of a man more interested in winning arguments than serving people. And that impression made him the perfect villain in this story. Because when Ted Cruz leaned forward, jabbing his finger, interrupting Jasmine Crockett again and again, he wasn't just being himself. He was embodying everything people had come to resent about politics. The arrogance, the hypocrisy, the hunger for control disguised as conviction. He thought his old habits would serve him once again. He thought his pedigree, his sharpened debate skills, and his well-worn tactics of interruption would leave Crockett flustered, diminished, silenced. But what Cruz didn't realize was that he was walking straight into a trap of his own making. Because the very habits that built his reputation would become his undoing against Jasmine Crockett. To understand why Jasmine Crockett did not waver when Ted Cruz tried to bulldoze her, you have to know where she came from and what shaped her voice into one that refuses to be silenced. Crockett's story is rooted in Texas, a place where contradictions live side by side: wealth and poverty, pride and struggle, tradition and transformation. She grew up in a world where people like her, black, outspoken, committed to justice, were often told to stay in their place. But Crockett never accepted that boundary. She learned early that if she didn't defend her own voice, no one else would. Before Congress, she built her career as an attorney. But she wasn't chasing prestige or big law firm paychecks. She chose to stand beside the people most often ignored: the poor, the marginalized, the ones without access to power. She defended protesters, she fought for civil rights, and she carried into every courtroom a determination that justice should not belong only to the privileged. It was in those courtrooms that she sharpened the calm intensity that would one day stun Cruz into silence. She had seen intimidation before: judges who doubted her, opposing attorneys who underestimated her, colleagues who tried to talk over her. And she had learned to meet those challenges not with rage, but with resolve. Every interruption became fuel. Every dismissal became proof that her presence was necessary. Every door slammed shut only made her push harder. When Crockett arrived in Congress, she carried that same fire. But Washington is not an easy place for someone who refuses to play small. In hearing rooms and debates, she was often interrupted, dismissed, or brushed aside by those who thought seniority or bluster outweighed truth. She knew what it was to be the newcomer surrounded by men who wielded their voices like weapons. And yet, she refused to bend. Her philosophy of politics has never been about power for its own sake. She doesn't see a congressional seat as a throne, but as a platform to serve those who rarely get heard. To her, the role of a leader is not to dominate but to amplify, to make sure that dignity, fairness, and justice are not abstract words, but lived realities for her constituents. That conviction set her apart. She didn't care about theatrics. She cared about the people back home: the single mothers balancing two jobs, the students drowning in debt, the families still waiting for their voices to count. Crockett saw their struggles as her own, and that connection made her fearless. And so when opponents tried to belittle her, it wasn't just her pride at stake. It was the dignity of everyone she represented. That's what gave her words weight. That's what made her calm replies land harder than the loudest interruptions. Her journey has been marked by resilience, by the refusal to give in even when the odds leaned against her. She had built her career not by silencing others, but by outlasting them, by holding her ground until the truth stood clear on its own. So by the time she found herself across from Ted Cruz, she had already lived through 1,000 versions of that moment. Men talking over her, authority figures doubting her, systems designed to push her voice aside. And every time she had come back stronger, sharper, more grounded in the belief that justice speaks loudest when delivered with clarity and calm. That belief, that unshakable compass, was what made her different from Cruz. Where he wielded arrogance, she carried dignity. Where he performed for attention, she spoke for people. Where he interrupted, she listened, and then delivered replies that cut deeper because they were rooted in lived truth. This is why audiences watching couldn't help but admire her. They weren't just seeing a congresswoman. They were seeing the arc of her entire journey, an attorney who defended the voiceless, an activist who stood in the streets, a woman who rose in a system designed to keep her down. They saw themselves in her resilience, in her insistence on being heard, in her refusal to let anyone strip her of her voice. That's why, in the moment against Cruz, her composure felt like more than just strategy. It felt like destiny. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to match his interruptions with interruptions of her own. She only needed to lean on the same resilience that had carried her through every battle before. And so, when Cruz tried to corner her with interruptions, Crockett leaned on the same resilience that had carried her through every battle before. The hearing room was already thick with tension before Ted Cruz even spoke. The cameras rolled, the microphones caught every breath, and the audience braced themselves. When Cruz leaned forward, his voice carried the tone of a man who had no intention of asking questions, only making statements. "Congresswoman, let me stop you right there." Interruption 1. Sharp. Abrupt. Crockett had barely begun her point before Cruz sliced through her words, redirecting the spotlight to himself. She paused steady, her face revealing none of the irritation that the room was beginning to feel. She tried again, calmly resuming her sentence. "Now with respect to..." Interruption 2. Louder this time, Cruz's words spilling over hers like a flood meant to drown her out. The staffers at the edge of the room shifted in their seats, uneasy. Viewers watching could almost hear the unspoken thought. He wasn't debating, he was steamrolling. Crockett inhaled, slow and measured. She let him finish his tirade, then attempted once more to reclaim her voice. But he was waiting. Interruption 3. His finger jabbed the air, his tone sharpened. He wasn't letting her build an argument. He was cutting her down in fragments. Hopping the fragments would look like failure. The heartbeat of the moment grew louder. Not literally, but in the way the tension pulsed, in the way each interruption quickened the rhythm of injustice. Crockett tried again, and again Cruz struck. Interruption 4. Interruption 5. Each one landing not with insight but with arrogance. Each one grinding against the patience of everyone in that chamber. By now, Crockett's composure was almost uncanny. She sat still, her expression calm, as if each interruption only proved her point. But for those watching, anger simmered. It was in the shifting of bodies in their chairs. It was in the murmurs exchanged behind hands. It was in the sense that this wasn't just politics. It was a man trying to silence a woman who had every right to be heard. Interruption 6. Cruz's smirk curled slightly, convinced he had seized control. To him, dominance wasn't about winning an argument, it was about preventing one from happening at all. And in that instant, it seemed he had succeeded. The rhythm was his. The hearing was his stage. But Crockett hadn't spoken her final word. Because by the sixth interruption, it seemed Cruz had won control of the exchange. But the seventh would change everything. For 6 interruptions, Jasmine Crockett had sat steady, letting Ted Cruz perform his familiar routine of domination. He jabbed the air, he raised his voice, he filled the room with bluster. Each time she opened her mouth, he leapt in, convinced the 7th time would silence her completely. But this time, something shifted. Crockett leaned forward, her hands folded neatly on the desk in front of her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his aggression. She simply waited until his words trailed off into self-satisfaction, until the pause between his sentences grew just wide enough for her to step through. And then, with the calm precision of a surgeon, she began. "Senator Cruz," she said, her tone level, unhurried, "if your intention here is to speak over me, I suppose you've already accomplished that. But if your intention is to uncover the truth, then perhaps you should allow me to finish a sentence." The room stilled. For the first time, Cruz didn't immediately lunge back in. Crockett had cut straight to the heart of his tactic, nomming it, exposing it, dismantling it in a single breath. She continued, her cadence deliberate. You have interrupted me 6 times. 6 times not to clarify, not to debate in good faith, but to silence. And silence, Senator, is not the same as winning. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Cruz shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering just slightly. Crockett pressed forward, every word deliberate, every phrase honed with the sharp edge of clarity. Let me be clear about my record, since that seems to be your favorite target. I have spent my career defending people who don't have your platform, your privilege, or your microphone. I've stood in courtrooms where my clients didn't get the luxury of being heard. I've spoken for communities that you, with all due respect, rarely speak to at all. So if you think cutting me off makes me less credible, you're mistaken. It makes you less accountable. Gasps, a sharp intake of breath from someone in the audience. The kind of reaction that told you she had struck a nerve not only with Cruz, but with everyone listening. Crockett didn't let the moment slip. She steadied her gaze directly at Cruz, her voice unwavering. Because this chamber, this Congress, does not belong to interruptions. It does not belong to grandstanding. It belongs to the American people. And they deserve answers. They deserve honesty. They deserve dignity. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm speaking. And that's why I will not be silenced by you or anyone else. For once, Cruz had no words. His mouth opened as if to retort, then closed again. His eyes darted, searching for footing, but none appeared. Crockett's voice, by contrast, grew steadier, stronger. She laid out facts, one by one, dismantling his criticisms with precision. Where Cruz had tried to smear her record, she answered with numbers, votes, receipts of her service. Where he had mocked her experience, she countered with evidence of real lives impacted by her work. Every point he thought was an attack became, in her hands, proof of purpose. Senator, you call yourself a champion of the people, she said, her tone almost gentle now, but let's be honest about which people you're championing. Because when families in Texas froze during the blackout, you were on a plane to Cancun. When working families begged for relief, you offered them speeches. And when your own constituents struggled, your greatest contribution was a soundbite. That is not service. That is performance. And this country deserves better. The room erupted. Not in applause yet, but in sound. Gasps, whispers, murmurs tumbling like dominoes. Even some who had been skeptical couldn't help but acknowledge the force of what they were witnessing. Crockett let the noise swell, then cut cleanly through it. So yes, Senator, you can interrupt me 6 times. You can raise your voice. You can wave your finger. But here's what you cannot do. You cannot erase the truth. And the truth is this: dignity will always outlast arrogance. Service will always outshine self-interest. And no amount of interruptions will change that. Silence, the kind of silence that feels like sound, heavy and undeniable. Cruz's smirk was gone. His jaw clenched, his eyes dropped for a moment to the desk before him. His hands, once animated, now stilled. And then it happened. The eruption. Applause broke out, not formal, not orderly, but real. People in the chamber clapped, some even stood, their voices rising in support. On social media, clips of her words would soon go viral. Hashtags would surge. But in that moment, in that room, the truth had landed like thunder. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply leaned back, her composure intact, her presence unshaken. She had spoken her truth, and the silence of her opponent was proof enough that it had struck deep. Ted Cruz had built his career on debate domination, on filibusters and filigrees of rhetoric. But in that instant, none of it mattered. Because when arrogance meets dignity, arrogance eventually collapses. And there he sat, silent, searching for words that would not come. The audience watching at home felt it too, that mix of satisfaction and vindication, the rare thrill of seeing justice delivered not with volume but with clarity. They saw not just a congresswoman holding her ground, but a symbol of what representation should look like: calm, courageous, unyielding in the face of bluster. It was the mic drop moment, the reply that didn't just silence an interruption but redefined the exchange. And yet, as powerful as it was, the battle didn't end in that room. The shockwaves traveled far beyond. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's words didn't stay trapped in the committee room. It spilled out through the cameras, ricocheted across screens, and within minutes was everywhere. By the time the gavel fell, Twitter was already ablaze. Crockett shuts down Cruz surged into the trending column, climbing higher with each refresh. Short clips of the moment, Cruz leaning forward, his smirk fatting, Crockett's calm reply slicing through, were shared thousands, then tens of thousands of times. Memes flooded in, images of Cruz frozen mid-interruption with captions like, "Volume down, dignity up," and silenced by facts. TikTok users looped Crockett's line, "Dignity will always outlast dramatic music," turning it into an anthem. For progressives, it was vindication. Commentators and activists tweeted in unison, "This is how you handle arrogance. This is what representation looks like." The satisfaction was collective, not just in watching a powerful senator fall silent, but in seeing a rising congresswoman hold her ground with grace. Cable news picked it up by evening. Pundits framed it as more than a clash of personalities. Some called it a generational fight. Cruz, the embodiment of old-guard politics steeped in grandstanding, versus Crockett, the new voice of accountability and justice. Others saw it as symbolic, a woman of color refusing to be shouted down by a man who had built his career on doing exactly that. Influencers added fuel. Instagram posts paired Crockett's words with quotes about resilience and dignity. TikTok creators layered her voice over montages of marches, protests, and young voters casting ballots. It wasn't just a viral moment anymore. It was being woven into a larger narrative of justice and representation. Even politicians joined in. Some of Crockett's colleagues tweeted praise, framing her composure as a lesson in how to meet arrogance without stooping to its level. A few conservatives tried to downplay it, claiming Cruz had simply yielded the floor. But the silence on his end, captured on camera, told a story louder than any spin. What made the moment powerful wasn't just the takedown, it was what it represented. For everyday citizens who had felt dismissed, talked over, or ignored, Crockett's calm stance was a mirror. She wasn't just defending herself against Cruz, she was embodying their frustration, their dignity, their refusal to be erased. And that struck deeper than any single viral clip. By the weekend, late-night hosts were replaying it, comedians were riffing on it, and hashtags like Seventh Interruption and Mic Drop Moment had turned into shorthand for calling out arrogance. Crockett, without raising her voice, had become a symbol. She showed that composure could be stronger than noise, that truth could outlast performance. For a generation raised in a storm of soundbites and shouting matches, her silence-breaking reply was proof that authenticity still matters. It wasn't just about Cruz anymore. It was about the kind of leadership people wanted to see, calm, grounded, unshaken in the face of bluster. But beyond the viral fame, the deeper meaning of this clash would echo even louder. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett didn't bask in the spotlight. She didn't need to. Instead, she reframed the moment, turning what others called a shutdown into something bigger, something enduring. "This was never about me versus Senator Cruz," she said in an interview. "It was about whether dignity could outlast arrogance, whether truth could silence bluster." And that's exactly what people saw. The clash became a lesson, not just a headline. Because in the performance-driven theater of modern politics, interruption has become a weapon. Shouting louder has too often replaced listening longer. But Crockett proved something radical. Democracy doesn't require dominance, it requires respect. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was strength. It was the kind of strength that doesn't flash across the screen with fireworks but settles in people's hearts, reminding them what leadership can be. Crockett's reply showed that you don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to match arrogance with arrogance. You can meet it with clarity, with principle, with dignity, and still win. For Americans weary of endless shouting matches, this mattered. It was proof that politics doesn't have to be noise. It can be grounded in truth. It can uplift instead of demean. And it can remind us that silence, when earned, when commanded through integrity, can be the most powerful answer of all. In an age of shouting, Crockett reflected, sometimes silence is the loudest answer. Her words hit deeper than a single viral moment. They touched a nerve in a country struggling to redefine democracy. Because at its core, democracy isn't about who can shout the loudest or who can interrupt the most. It's about listening. It's about ensuring every voice, especially the ones too often drowned out, has its rightful place in the conversation. Crockett's composure carried that truth into the national consciousness, and people responded not just with applause but with a sense of empowerment. They saw that dignity could still prevail. They saw that arrogance, no matter how loud, eventually folds under the weight of truth. And that's why this wasn't just a shutdown, it was a turning point. Ted Cruz interrupted Jasmine Crockett 6 times, each one an attempt to bulldoze, to dominate, to silence. But on the 7th, she refused to be pushed aside. Her words landed with precision, her calm disarmed his bluster, and in that moment, silence filled the room. Silence that spoke louder than all of Cruz's interruptions combined. That's the story behind the headline. Not just a viral clash, not just a trending hashtag, but a living reminder that dignity is greater than arrogance. That composure outlasts chaos. That truth still has the power to cut through the noise. Jasmine Crockett didn't just shut Cruz down, she lifted something up. A vision of politics that isn't about volume but about values. One where strength isn't measured in how often you can interrupt, but in how firmly you can stand, even when the storm rages around you. And now the question becomes, what do we do with that vision? Do we let it fade as just another viral clip, or do we carry it forward as a standard for the leaders we want, the voices we honor, the democracy we defend? If you believe truth still matters in America, share this story. Let others see that arrogance doesn't have to win, that respect and resilience still have a place in our politics. And subscribe for more of these defining moments, the battles shaping not just headlines but the future of this country. Because sometimes, the calmest voice in the room is the one history remembers.